started to have some really nice questions coming in. So thank you very much to everyone who's put your questions into the Q&A, and please carry on doing so. Welcome back to Lisa and Zach. I hope if you've had a chance to have a look, let's start with Nick Dixon's put a question just following on from what Mark was saying. He's saying he totally agrees with the idea of a 40-60 remote working office split. I also think there's a big difference between existing teams adapting to work remotely and newly formed teams or new starters. He's saying as a manager of a small team, 4 or 5 people delivering a lottery partnership scheme, all recruited during COVID. I'm sure that's ringing a bell for everybody. I feel there's a real need for us to be in the office together for a good part of the week. This will allow us to develop better as a team. So thoughts on that from initially Mark, and I guess anyone else if you have anything to add.
Yeah, Nick, I think thank you for those thoughts and question. And I think what you're saying is it's not a sort of black and white issue. These things evolve over time, not just at an organizational level, but for individuals and for teams. So clearly, if you've got a new starter, whether it's online or face-to-face, you're going to spend more time with that person from an induction point of view, giving them the technical knowledge and the cultural kind of fit knowledge that they need for your organization. And sometimes, and in fact, I've just got a brand new head of marketing on that cover joined yesterday. I spent the day, face-to-face with folks. I felt that having time together, breaking bread and having lunch together, walking to get the sandwich, all of those sort of physical things were an important part of me signaling to her how important it was that she's joining the organisation. And I, as her director, value her and want to spend the time with her, not just click in and click out of a meeting. So I'm kind of really supporting what you're saying there, Nick.
Could I just offer something as well about that? What I read in Nick's question is that he feels there is a real need for them all to be in an office together for a good part of the week to facilitate these things, but and which I can totally understand. But what we found is we couldn't hire the best people for the jobs that we had on offer if we had to ask them to move somewhere to be in a physical location. So, but obviously, our work is very different and we're traveling around the country. So there are opportunities for us to be together as a team in other places. And we accept that in terms of the way we expense jobs and, all the rest of it. But we use those moments where the team comes together in other places to facilitate the sort of team building aspects of what Nick was talking about. So what I would say is that might really work for you as a manager. And then, because of the responsibilities that you have, you need to implement that so you can do your job better. But maybe think about what that means for the people that you're asking to be in a certain place for that amount of time. And there are ways to learn roles, to share ideas, and to bond that don't involve bringing people together at the same time.
And I'd just like to add as well that there's a really good book called The Art of Gathering that talks a lot about different ways of people meeting, and I think that's a really good, I say it's one of the cornerstone books for us all to learn about this. To Nick's question around it, should you be face-to-face or not, and to Lisa's point, because I think the answer, and it comes from my typical computer background, is it depends, doesn't it? There are different times when it is great to bring people together, and there are other times when actually it really doesn't matter. So that's why I was saying to Mark, half tongue in cheek, that the whole 60-40 thing felt to me like a fudge. Like, we're doing it because actually legally you have to say basically a remote worker or you're based in an office. That's not actually solving our real problems. Now, that's not to say that the market and others can't make it all work. I just think we should all be looking at our specific context, the experience of members of staff, us having ways of addressing the problems. So the biggest problem I hear, for example, is people assume that young people will not get promoted if they're not in the office. And as far as I'm aware, that's a myth. I'm not saying it won't necessarily happen in the next 2 or 3 years, but it takes all of us on this video call right now to ensure it doesn't happen. Like, surely our metric of people getting promoted isn't about who tells the best jokes in the office, who buys the fanciest cakes. So I think there's a lot of work for us to do to be more inclusive and to think about that art of gathering. And it's a really good book, so do check it out if you can. Probably available in your local library as well.
There's a fantastic, the author is Priya Parker. There's a fantastic interview with her that Brené Brown has done, which I noticed that my colleague Alex put the link to the book in, but if you could put the link into the podcast, it's on Spotify, it's free. It's a really great interview, which is a kind of easy way if you're out, going for a walk. It's a good way to get some of this in. Thank you for that. So just following on, I think there's another really interesting question here around this idea of accessibility and equity. So Than's put a question in initially to Zach, but she's saying she agrees with your proposition on propositioning the opportunity that hybrid working brings for flexibility and accessibility, but she's interested in how we address equity when it comes to hybrid working and how operationally some roles allow for advantages of what hybrid working brings more than others. Mark, you spoke a little bit to that too. And when we have buildings to staff, what processes can we have in place to enable fairness of opportunity to hybrid roles across work? So Zach, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think it's about being transparent and very clear about what roles are allowed to do. So I think Mark talked about the example being very clear when they recruit about who has a role and what that role does. So for example, if I was a pilot, I would expect to fly the plane, right, and not be back at base. And I think the team who fly the plane, the flight attendants, for example, they accept and understand that their job is to be on the plane all day compared to the office staff. So as long as there's very clear guidance about why someone has a different role from you, it's about then looking about speaking to those staff and understanding what they also might think would help to make it more equitable. So if your job means that you're spending a lot of time away from your desk and you're with customers, for example, are there other benefits that we can add that aren't necessarily the working from home direct benefits? Are there things that we can do, the soft part of the job that should help people? Because, so for example, understanding what proportion of the job actually has to happen face to face is one thing, and then accepting to say to people, you know what, we're going to give people a whole day or more, it doesn't matter percentage wise, where we don't mind if they come to work or we don't come to work. So I have some staff, for example, who want to come to work because the cost of heating their home, running their home, is prohibitive, right? So they want to come to the office because it's more cost effective for them. That's not the same for someone who lives an hour away. So I think it's about looking at individuals and then being consistent across the organisation. So you don't have us and them mentality to make it change. What I would also say is it's evolving. So it's really about us all now understanding what people's gripes are with others doing other things and really assessing that. And that's happened actually before the pandemic. So it wasn't even remote working. There are some people who would say that if you work in an office, that has an unfair advantage versus someone else doing another type of role. So it's about really kind of going back to the root causes and issues and making sure that it's seen as a fair process for people. And then also having the ability to people, in our organization, for example, we're trying to experiment with having potentially hybrid roles even, where people get the ability for a period of the day, the day, week, year, however, to swap roles to enable them to try different ways of doing things and seeing if they like that as well. But I know Lisa's got a hand up.
Lisa.
Yeah, I wanted to build off that and just say, it's important to understand what the people who don't have hybrid roles like visitor services or other kinds of services where they have to be on site, what do they perceive as the advantages of having the hybrid role that might make them feel like they didn't have parity, So understanding why they feel like they're not getting as good of a deal as the people who can work hybrid, I think is the root of all of this, because then you can find other ways to service that need in them so they do feel like they've got parity. But again, we have to be realistic about this stuff for those of us who run venues or whatever, that some people just aren't going to be able to do the hybrid thing in the same way. But I think it goes a long way to be really clear as an organization that you recognize that and that you're doing your best to service it. And I've read about there are some solutions out there already for that, but really you have to have the conversation. Like if, for example, if you're giving people a gym membership, we see this a lot in my sector, companies sort of saying these are our benefits, it's amazing, great, you're giving people gym memberships, but you're not giving them a workable schedule so that they can actually go to the gym ever. So let's figure out some benefits and stuff that are portable and that everyone can enjoy.
Mark, did you want to add anything or?
Yeah, I just picking up what Lisa was saying there was in the case where people have roles that do require them to be more fixed. So I'm just thinking about actually our footpath team who are literally building or mending footpaths across Scotland so that people can access the hills safely. Their work is physical. It is has to be done kind of face to face. It's very seasonal. There's some months of the year where they just can't do that from a safe kind of point of view. And there's also a kind of light hours of the day issue. So their work is constrained by the outdoor settings, if I kind of put it like that. But to answer Lisa's question around, how do you build benefits in for people who have the most extreme version of old style of physical kind of working? I think what we'd say is we're finding that by giving people the right tools, they can stay in touch with the wider organisation's work to build that shared sense of mission and purpose. I think it's allowing us to internally and externally to showcase their efforts. So rather than their work happens and the outside world just doesn't realise how that footpath came about, we can take content and share that content through. And in fact, we're trying to encourage more of our employees at the coalface to do that content themselves. So you're getting that frontline story from the team. Therefore, it means that more of my colleagues are attached to that shared sense of mission and purposeful delivery rather than just making a footpath. And so for me, that's a very positive thing, because it allows everyone to feel like a heritage hero rather than just somebody who does footpaths over there.
Yeah, this sense of purpose is clearly, it's really important part of all of this. We've got quite a few questions around some practical stuff. So I want to start with with one from Saskia, which is to you, Lisa. Can you elaborate a bit more on the term social contracts, please?
Yeah, so that's part of the way that we check in terms of the resilience, meaning the mental and physical health of our team, with social contracts. And it can be formal and it can be informal. We have a formalized version, which is called Dignity at Work and On Site. And that is an agreement between my team and our participants of how we are actually going to engage with each other, both in person and online. And then our team social contracts involve, how often we're going to be on all team meetings, how often we're going to do our check-ins on our one-to-ones. And, to be perfectly honest, coming out of COVID, we've been less good about the one-to-ones and having those be, more regular, but the pace of work just hasn't allowed for it. But those were some of the things that we started doing right away. And that's been really helpful in terms of creating those sort of safe spaces for them. But also we've instituted a buddy system. The buddy system is part of the social contract. Is what we basically say is, look, if you have something you don't want to escalate to your line manager, or you don't want anyone else in the team to know about. I mean, this during the actual height of the pandemic, this was important because, people were having some serious issues. And so, we gave everyone a buddy, and the buddy is the person that you can talk to about that stuff in the cone of immunity, totally confidential, that, as long as those were results orientated. So it wasn't just to bitch or to turn inward in a negative way, but to find solutions for the things that you were feeling. And if that needed something more from the team, and then, to escalate it upward. So the social contract can be both formal and informal, but it's a really important page for you both to be on to start with if you're going to be remote.
Great, thank you. There's some other questions around the challenges for emerging and young professionals who are kind of starting out and having to work online, maybe working from their bedrooms. I know that was happening with one of the staff members at COPS24, not having a home office, tactics on how you guys have been dealing with that.
I'd kick off by saying, again, think about it. So think with purpose about, what are our measures of success as an organisation? I think what I've come to realise is, in my career certainly, is you have an annual appraisal and you get rated poor, good, great. Everyone gets average because it's easier for everyone to do that, right? People don't adjust the negative problems, and people don't have one-to-ones. There's no easy metrics for people to say your performance throughout the year. And so I would say that we're at the very beginning again of how we then support people actually early in their career. So again, demonstrate that they're doing a really good job and how that can then lead to transferable skills in other areas. Again, in my experience, transition to manager, not a single question. I've never, ever, and now lead an organization of 140 people. I've never, ever had a question that asked me about how good I was at managing people. They were always about, can you look after spreadsheets? Can you do this? Can you do that? And it's fascinating to me. I think it's a complete blind spot to professional development, not just in our sector, just generally, that we are now facing the challenges of what the pandemic has brought to light. Is it's actually you working really hard and doing a good job is not a safe direct indicator of your progression through your organisation. So I think that's definitely something we're going to be looking at, very, very soon. But what I would encourage people to do is to take advantage of whatever equivalents are at the moment. So if lots of organisations are starting to move to having 2 or 3 times a year meetups, using those actually as an opportunity to really get to know what people are doing. I'd also say to shout about your work. Too few people, this is even before the pandemic, actually, when they're doing a good job, they expect people to notice them. I always encourage people to make sure that they take the opportunity for staff newsletter or staff meeting to let people know they're doing well. I know that introverts are kind of more difficult, but what I would say is just to try to find mechanisms, whether writing or speaking, to help support them on that. Because I would say, the current model of progression is not a fair one. And I don't think that's the fault of hybrid working. I think that's our lack of ability as leaders in organizations.
Do you have your hand up? Was that from before? Oh.
No. What I wanted to say, building off of what Zach said, I think the second part to that question was, what about young professionals living in shared accommodation who don't have a home office, who don't have the tools? And again, I would say, look at what the expectation is in terms of the output. Like, what is the work that these people are producing? Can they do their work to standard, like Zach was saying? Like, can they still feel like they are doing good work, and not have to be bound to the 9 to 5 when everyone else is trying to be online, when your kids might be using the broadband or whatever, like finding ways so that the work that they actually are expected to produce can still be appreciated and maybe done when they do have more access to, for example, to devices or to broadband or to get to a place where there's more space for them to work. So thinking creatively around solutions to focusing on the work rather than the time of day or whatever it's being done.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Mark, on in introducing new staff, how you've worked around that?
Yeah, so just sort of building out the conversation we've just been having here. I think about that sort of visibility for folks who are newer into their careers. Actually, I think one of the big pluses of hybrid working, particularly because of the kind of use of Teams and Zoom, is I've noticed more junior members of teams get brought to directors' meetings to present items themselves, which might not always happen quite the same way physically. So I'm finding that more people are being showcased for their skills earlier in their career. So actually there are pluses there in terms of giving people visibility, as long as people have the ability to present kind of effectively through the screen. But in terms of introducing people, I think that some of this stuff is about just making sure an organisation has a very clear induction programme. And increasingly, I think what we're finding at the Trust is we want our induction programme as pre-recorded video files so that I can offer people a guaranteed presentation from all of the departments across the organisation, rather than physically trying to bring people together once every month or every quarter for the kind of notional corporate induction. Because if you've joined and it's 3 months to the corporate induction, that's a long time to wait to get to people. Whereas I can give people access to all the departments and all the key people on their first day. And that's something that wouldn't have been possible otherwise.
Yeah, it's that freedom that asynchronous communication gives us all, that's so important. But it's gearing up for that, isn't it? It's getting ready and getting the resources and being prepared, and that's a job in itself. There's a question here from Helen, again a practical one, around tips and recommendations for facilitating hybrid meetings. We have been considering various options such as Owl Labs, Meeting Owl, which is not something I've heard of actually. I don't know whether you guys have. But keen to hear about anything that works for people.
Again, I think it's about setting a social contract, right, around what is acceptable and when you're going to do it and how you're best going to do it. So, for example, I've been to a few hybrid meetings of late where no one really wants the hybrid person to be on the call, and they go, oh, this is going to be a pain, right? And we'll stick a laptop in the corner, and if they can hear us, they can hear us. If they can't hear us, that's just tough luck, right? So I'd say a basic thing, right, is obviously having the right technology to support hybrid working. And the next thing, which goes back to being a child almost. When you're a kid, they'd put you in a big circle and they'd say, if you've got a tennis ball, you can speak. So everyone gets the opportunity to speak, right? It's like going back to that almost. It's saying, do you know what? We're going to go around the room. It happens to be that person's online, and we're gonna let them speak. So I think some of this, I've got a child in primary school right now. I think I can learn a lot from primary school teachers. I think in how to operate in those kinds of meetings is what I would say. And also I had a really good tip from someone who said that they, in their organisation, that they agreed that they agree in advance. 100% of people had to agree if a hybrid meeting was allowed before the meeting, and they say, right, well, it's actually going to face-to-face meeting, like for pros and cons, to just be super clear to people and say, look, we're not going to make it. We've concluded that certain styles of meeting have to be all together or all online. I like that idea actually. They're saying, like, does it help us for hybrid all the time? But they're kind of saying, make it all aligned might be actually better for some people than trying to do a little combination of it.
And I would add to that, like, what do you want out of the meeting and how many people are going to be in it? So it's not necessarily about the platform. I don't think there's going to be any platform all of a sudden that's going to make these meetings more productive or easier to run when they're hybrid in that way, but it's about how you structure it. And as you know, circulating a set of questions or like the problem set that you're trying to answer, like having an online decision board ahead of time, the meeting, like, where do you want to take this conversation? Where does it need to end up? What do you need out of it? And doing as much of that as you can before you actually get into that moment is really, really helpful. You know, online decision boards are something that we do. Online, whiteboards are something that we do. And a lot of it, we all know by now, I think that online takes 3 times as much effort and time as just doing stuff in person. So it's building in that prep time before you actually go into the hybrid meeting format.
Mark, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I mean, really just a couple of practical bits, from me. I've noticed, building on Lisa's point there around things take longer sometimes, is I sit on our National Trust of Scotland USA Foundation board that's served out of the States. And I think I find the American team there are very formal about their, formal proposers and seconders and votes and vote count and stuff like that. And so therefore you do need to make sure that everyone has cameras on and you've got the hand protocol and people hold their hands, and the chair is very strict about counting the room, kind of stuff like that. So depending on the environment, you need to make sure that formal governance protocols are kind of adhered to. One of my bugbears will be on hybrid meetings is the camera on, camera off kind of issue. I guess there's always situations where somebody has a reason not to have their camera on. But I guess if I was in a face-to-face meeting with my directorate, I wouldn't, be deliberate here, I wouldn't imagine people hiding underneath the table and not being seen. So I think it's quite disarming as a kind of director and leader of a people. If you're presenting to your team, you kind of want to see people and see their reaction and bounce off of them. And so I'm trying to ask people, at the trust to say, unless there's exceptional reason, please have your cameras on so we can have that shared sense of community, even though we're not physically together.
Yeah. Again, it's coming back to that sense of trust and culture, isn't it? And how you build that. I mean, one of the things we do obviously a lot of work now online at Culture 24, and we just try and just keep everything very people-centered and be clear what the expectation is. When are you presenting? When are people receiving information? When are they communicating? Using the breakout rooms. I mean, as Lisa said, I don't think there's any magic platform that's going to make this stuff easier. It's how we as humans construct the space and allow those conversations to happen. Just really quickly, we've got like 1 more minute, just final thoughts from you. Got a great question from Tan on how do we build a harmonious high performance culture? Thoughts on that before we just finally wrap up.
I'll go first. I think for me is admitting that the current way of doing things wasn't the best way of doing things, and that we will strive together, as a workforce and as a sector, to make it better. So let's identify the problems and iterate to make the organisations better, better for all, rather than just slowly heading towards the big iceberg. Yeah,
and we are the eternal 2-year-old in the room. It's like, why? At this point, moving forward into the new way of working is we have to unlearn. It's innovation, right? We have to unlearn the things that we just accepted before as the reasons why things have to be that way. So starting with why, really, for me, always.
And for me, my scratch record would be, in any context, hybrid or otherwise, is make sure your organisational sense of purpose is clear to everybody in your organisation, and that you have a clear set of values by which you govern the way you work together. And therefore, face-to-face, online, hybrid, whatever else, those things come through.
Brilliant. Thank you guys so much.